I think one of the most important lessons, it's great you're studying social movements, or at least have an interest in them, is the role of emotion here. There was tremendous anger, and I think that comes right through the screen, because people were dying, and there was a lot of evidence that the city, the state, the federal government were not responding, that big pharma was making a lot of money but wasn't producing any drugs, that everything was stacked against people who happened to get this disease. That anger rose in the early years. In the early years, there wasn't a whole lot to do except take people to a hospital or a doctor and die. Quickly, nonprofit social service agencies were set up that had support groups, delivered all kinds of services, but they were not willing to confront the political establishment. About 5-6 years into the epidemic, there was enough anger that ACT UP formed and took off, and as you can see, politicians and big institutions were confronted at every step. And one of the pieces you see a lot of on the screen is street protest. But there was much more to ACT UP. Sometimes you'll see our weekly meetings, but a tremendous amount of intellectual work, writing reports, and basically becoming experts, because if we were going to beat the people in power at their own game, we had to know everything. So let me open it up.
How do you think, because I know recently there was the big scandal with the CEO, Martin Shkreli, I think his name was, raising the price of, I think it was an HIV drug by 5,000%. What was your reaction to that? I know it's more modern rather than, because ACT UP obviously started in 1987, but what was your reaction to that? And the friends that you still have that are with you today that were in the movement, what was their reaction to it?
That's a great question, because one of the ways that ACT UP evolved in the early months and year or two, what our chants often were drugs into bodies. And later, that evolved into healthcare access. Healthcare access meaning we were more or less pushing single payer way back when nobody would even think about that. So to look at Shkreli, I'm never sure how to say his name, what I think about is not so much what he's doing, but the failure of the government to do serious structural healthcare reform and to regulate drug prices. So if there was strong organizing, people could have had fun at that hearing in Washington where he testified. So all the heat's on Shkreli, but they don't, nobody's saying what's the real issue behind this.
Are you guys still active in legislation to this day? Do you go up to Washington if there's an issue or a discrepancy?
The group ACT UP continues. Some of the conditions, though, in those days have changed. There is what some people informally call drug cocktail. So AIDS is now viewed as a chronic condition rather than a fatal disease. And some of the shift, which we fought for back then, was more money and more resources dedicated to HIV. Is there more to do? Absolutely. I mean, I don't know how many of you deal with healthcare issues on a daily basis, but it is a continuing struggle, a political struggle that requires organizing. And one of the lessons from ACT UP and AIDS as a deadly epidemic is that even in the face of, we would hear the names of our members who died every week announced at the beginning of the meeting. Even in the face of that, you've got to fight back.
So with every kind of protest movement or movement at all, you see sometimes it can get chaotic, right? And I think throughout the film, there were some points where you could say, wow, it's crazy, got a little violent here and there. But I guess what I'm trying to ask you is, did that influence people to not join ACT UP? Or, I mean, did that influence people to become part of this movement? Like, how did you guys keep increasing the numbers of people to continue to be active within the movement itself?
Well, ACT UP was more militant than radical. I mean, it was a radical idea to confront healthcare reform and the need for treatment and all, but the militants both brought us members, and sometimes people were scared or turned off at that approach. But part of what happened is that the initial numbers in the room, the room was barely filled when I joined ACT UP, and we got so many people coming just to the main meeting, let alone the committee meetings, that we moved to Cooper Union's Great Hall, which holds 900 people. So when you look at social movements, ACT UP is kind of a standout because it was not a mass movement, but we had chapters all over the country and some internationally that managed to do quite a lot with, I don't want to say small numbers of people, but in the big scheme of things, like compared to, I worked in anti-war movements, which involved, gigantic demonstrations. The biggest demo that ACT UP was involved in New York was about 7,000 people, and that was with a reproductive rights movement group. It was co-organized. So it helped and hurt. And Larry Kramer, I think, said it well on screen, because after the demonstration at St. Patrick's Cathedral, every single editorial page slammed us. I remember being at the press conference the next day. It was scary for us to create that much of a backlash, but then you start to think about it and realize, wow, suddenly we have power to galvanize people and get them to listen to what we're saying. But the brain part, I mean, it's great to go on the street and, you can see what elaborate training there was for civil disobedience and direct action. The breaking of the glass, that was fairly unusual. In some situations, property damage can end up drawing all the media attention and taking it away from whatever point you're trying to make.
And when you say the media attention can also bring a negative light to the group, because depending on how the media portrays it.
In the early days of the epidemic, you can actually go back and see what the coverage was even before AIDS had that name. It was this rare gay cancer. That's when I first heard about it. But compared to the coverage of, say, Legionnaire's disease, if anybody remembers that, or toxic shock syndrome, there was very little coverage. So we were also in a battle with the media. And some of this stuff was obviously staged. It was performative to get attention. And sometimes the media, would come along, and sometimes they wouldn't. But it wasn't just to get people arrested, it was to put our bodies on the line, putting our message across. The pressure and the organizing is what makes the difference. Sometimes you get progress from who gets elected to office, but I have an unusual viewpoint about politicians, which is I think they follow, they don't lead. They follow who has written them checks, but if you're out on the street, actually good moment for a prop, ACT UP had amazing visuals, and this, which you could just stick inside your jacket if you were at a rally, say in New Hampshire. Whether anybody was yelling or whether they cut the microphones off didn't matter, because just one turn of a photographer's lens and suddenly the message is there. That's what it'll take to get single payer. Good question. I was sort of drawing a blank. I'm sure there were supporters who were people of faith, but I don't know how much formal alliances we had with the faith communities. Going back to that earlier question, there were certainly some fault lines that opened up because the kind of establishment, I mean, gay, it's a little odd to talk about the gay realm in those days as having an establishment, but there were a lot of people like, where do you get off doing all this militant stuff? And so it took a lot to get our footing. And some of these protests, the one at the Food and Drug Administration, that one in particular put ACT UP on a national map. It was quite an event. But there were millions of people for whom life went on and they heard nothing of this. You know, it was like living in a small war zone. Okay.
Do you think the opposition to the movement and the fact that the issue of HIV and AIDS was being swept under the rug a lot of times was because of the fact that the majority, like the sufferers of the diseases happened to be homosexual? And
there was a battle not only for treatment but against stigma and prejudice, absolutely. So there were fascinating ways, I mean, you can hear it actually, like this documentary is suffused, we didn't use that word back then, with intersectionality, because there were, like, we had to both, or our commitment was to fight for sexual civil liberties in the midst of a deadly epidemic, because there were people who wanted, William F. Buckley advocated tattoos, there were people who were talking about quarantine. It seemed like a single issue, but actually a gigantic bundle of issues. And in that room, on Monday nights, there was an intricate agenda. There was tight facilitation. And often if something came to what we called the floor, that was the people who were at the Monday meetings, like the floor of Congress or something. And it didn't seem like it had a really close connection to AIDS. People would yell out, what has this got to do with AIDS? And you had to justify that connection. So we're always trying to keep our focus, even as AIDS was many sub-issues.
I just want to make a comment. The question the young man just asked, that was exactly the way Reagan felt. He was totally indifferent. He thought that they got what they deserved.
Right.
And so the thing was said from the top. He was totally indifferent to the epidemic that was going on.
Well, it was 6 years, I believe, before President Reagan uttered the word AIDS.
Right.
And you can see what we did with him as a visual, turning him into this like Frankenstein figure. But in those years, between 1981 or so, 1987, when ACT UP formed, the groups who were doing great stuff, AIDS Project Los Angeles, Gay Men's Health Crisis, People with AIDS Coalition, what grew into hundreds of social service advocacy groups around the country, money was hard to get, either foundation grants, individual donations, contracts. So they were not going to challenge the government, which is where we came in, where ACT UP came in, to make noise about what the allocation of resources was. And some of these fights, the last one was the last, this film is arranged chronologically, but the symptoms of the underlying conditions that AIDS constitutes was presenting itself much differently in women. And it involved this huge battle to get the definition reworked. And it probably couldn't have been done by people who worked in hospitals or worked in various kinds of agencies. It was going to happen when somebody just took it up as a cause. Brain power again, huge amount of brain power.
Do you think that we became aware of the AIDS when Rock Hudson had it?
There were different moments when awareness of AIDS spiked. There was a group called Visual AIDS that sprung up in the visual art world, and they created something that is almost, it doesn't mean anything by itself. It was a red ribbon. And they got the red ribbon on the Academy Awards one year. early when the Red Ribbon was first created, and that reached an audience that was just gigantic. So it was a real building process from hardly anybody knowing what was going on. And I should note that all this work you saw took place barely, I mean, typewriters were still around. Computers had arrived, but the internet had not arrived. So we were live, and when it came to getting information out, like, you didn't do a protest without a fact sheet. It would just be absolutely a no-no, because the idea was to convey information and persuade people. Many of those leaflets were wheat pasted all over Manhattan and other parts of New York. It's really hard to do that now, and of course it's sort of strange to wheat paste because we have the internet and all. But I think about that a lot because these days a lot of political activity has moved to the internet where you're clicking a mouse. And there are some advantages to that, but when you have people in a room together who can see each other and hear the tonation and the tones of voice and all, you can have a real meeting of the minds, which is why that organizing wave that you saw was so powerful. One other thing I should mention is that money. There was no payroll. And what that meant is that all the people you see doing all these things, some of them jaw-dropping, were doing it because they wanted to do it. Now, we had money around, like money started to arrive when people realized, wow, ACT UP is an important thing, we should support it. Like for bail, if people went to North Carolina and, I don't know, barricaded themselves in an office, a drug company executive office, and the bail was tens of thousands of dollars. So we would have that around, but it was never for individual compensation. It was for the expenses of doing the political work. And it's that's an interesting thing to think about because our political activity was a labor of love, and what bound us together was the fun. You know, whereas if you're working in an office or an organization, it's the paycheck. So often when you've got a totally volunteer effort like that, people get interested and they're having fun. There's no limit to what they'll do. I mean, I've been around a lot of organizing, and it's exciting because the more that I've learned, usually organically, the more I want to do it, and I want to see change. I don't think things change very quickly or at all by themselves. You've often got to really figure out a way, take your best shot. Occupy was also the twin emotions of anger and fun down at Zuccotti. Different kind of anger because it wasn't people dying every day, but it was about future prospects stolen, houses foreclosed, a world where a small number were getting richer and richer, and everybody else sensing there's something really wrong here. The fun was absolutely there. Different structures, though. ACT UP was open, as Occupy was. Anybody could walk in and participate, but ACT UP had a weekly meeting, so we kind of centralized our decision making with that weekly meeting. If you missed the meeting, you were really, sort of out of it. Occupy had big meetings, but it wasn't all one thing. Like if somebody wanted to set up another working group, they'd set up another working group. It avoided disagreements, but it also meant that we weren't all pulling together. Koch, I think, Ed Koch, mayor, was somewhat contrite years later and acknowledged the role that we played, giving him hell. Reagan, I'm not so sure.
He knew Hudson.
Yeah. But being willing to go after those people, ACT UP was gained a lot from having people around who were part of the 1970s gay, lesbian movement, but also Mike Spiegel, who's on screen, was involved in Students for Democratic Society. There were several people from the Black Panthers, And one of our tactics, it's not something we invented at all, it was really more 70s gay organizing, zaps. Seems like there's going to be a simple, peaceful community meeting or town meeting or something, a politician's going to come, and all of a sudden there are a lot of people who pull out signs and start chanting. So the surprise element kept people off balance. You can't use these tactics all the time, and it wasn't just the tactics we were using, it's that we had a thought out set of demands and why we were doing it.
What's the status of AIDS today? Is the epidemic over?
It is not over. It has changed, as I said, to a chronic, manageable condition. There are some epidemics, populations that are affected differently. Young men of color are heavily impacted by the epidemic still. So we see the number of cases, I'm not real current on the epidemiology, but we see the number of cases, new infections going down, but among some demographics, that's not true. And what would change that? More attention to prevention. And there's also this drug PrEP, which is a drug that's used to treat HIV, but is used so that you can't be infected. And I have mixed feelings about it because I lived through an era as a gay man where we all thought, well, if you get syphilis or something else, you just go and get a shot. And then HIV comes around and there is no shot for it. So sometimes nature has different ideas than whether we're invincible.
You mentioned the GMHC. How closely did ACT-UP work with GMHC, or if at all?
We collaborated sometimes, but other times we were quite at each other's throats.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, because they were somewhat on the establishment side, and of course they did have a payroll, so they couldn't take chances like we took. That's not to say, though, that we appreciated I'll put it in I appreciated their work, and I'm certain that many of the people who worked for AIDS service organizations, they would often leak us information or leak us what their wish list was because they couldn't move it themselves. We were the ones who were in a position to move it. So it's like good cop, bad cop stuff that often happened, which goes back to that initial question, was the militants bringing you support, or was it sending it away? Both.
Okay, so we're going to have to end in a minute, but maybe you could just conclude and say something that I know when students speak about the LGBTQ movement, one of the issues that they think it's all about gay marriage. And can you talk about how the history of gay protest kind of moved from being about sexual liberation to protesting AIDS to being almost solely focused on gay marriage, at least in the media?
That's true. That for at least a decade, one way to go and look back at gay history is 1969, the New York Police Department, their Vice Squad, made a routine raid on a bar in Greenwich Village called the Stonewall. And they got a big surprise, which is the patrons and the people on the street hanging out while the paddy wagons were being loaded. Were not happy about this raid, and there was a riot. Some say a rebellion, and it went on for several days. Before the first night was out, and I see a lot of nodding heads, so I think some of you know this history, and it's kind of, not the beginnings of sexual minority organizing, but it was a real watershed. And the reason why it was a watershed, very relevant to what you're studying, right away, people who were skilled organizers got out leaflets calling people to meetings. If that hadn't been done, it would have just been an odd, strange thing, a riot that went on for several days. But it spawned a whole bunch of groups, Gay Liberation Front, later Gay Activist Alliance. And the movement in those days was concerned about criminalization, people being busted for being with somebody of the same, for having sex. You know, we were criminalized in those days, and tremendous job discrimination and stigma. And then early in the 80s is when HIV arrived. So it was a very tumultuous period when a community started to come much more above ground and have to fight a deadly disease. And then some of those early aspirations and goals got sidetracked for marriage. And now I think the movement is sort of shifting gears. What do we stand for? I hope it's larger visions of social justice and not just equality. Equality is fine, but its liberation is a bigger, more interesting thing.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Did I use up all the time?
No, you can, we always,
Here's one of the bloody hands.
some of those up.
I mean, these are hard to see, but you saw them in the film. And this is something that would have been wheat pasted. It's got a lot of copy, but the big message, like the people who did ACT UP's graphics were very, very good at catching your eye and then making you read, you know, the small stuff. We also had some things that were a special size. This is the size of a subway car ad, and they got snuck in there as if they were real ads. So they were like our ACT UP propaganda. I thought I brought two of these. The best thing, this is when Ed Koch was running for mayor, and this would have been wheat pasted all over the place. The best thing Koch will probably do for people with AIDS, lose the election. I think you saw, I mean, again, you know, this thing, to this day, if you want to go to a political meeting and you got something about this size that just folds up real easy, very, very bold type and all, you're in. Oh, and here's one of the this one I don't think ever got worn, which is why it's in such good shape.
You can sell it on eBay.
And by itself, I mean, what does it mean, ACT UP? You know, it's like when you accuse a kid of acting up, you know, but AIDS Coalition Unleashed Power. And then the Keith Haring, who died of AIDS and was very much a member of ACT UP, he designed what was our best-selling t-shirt. And there were ways in which what we think of as like downtown Manhattan, meaning a world of, it's kind of like, it's not a geographic place, but a different kind of cultural space. ACT UP was very much at the center of it. It was actually possible to be doing politics and popular at the same time. It wasn't like a nerdy pursuit at all back then.